get settled before school starts in the fall. And that is why it's not great news that sales of new homes...
You pay attention with so much at stake.
Seas are rising and chronic flooding will be the new normal.
You navigate, you listen, you keep an ear out. You pay attention, and so do we. We tell the stories of our time every day.
In the 26th day of testimony and on the 139th witness, Shahar Tsarnaev wept.
We unearth what would otherwise stay hidden.
There's just a lot of hate in this world, and that day, for that hour, we were humans.
Across the street.
The Red Sox have won the World Series.
And around the globe.
It's here and now.
This is modern love.
This is WBUR's All Things Considered.
This is only a game.
This is On Point.
This is Radio Boston.
On air, online, on demand, and on stage in the heart of Boston.
I'm Jack Lepiars. Welcome to WBUR City Space.
Always looking forward, paying attention, and knowing that your story is one of our stories.
Good morning. I'm Bob Oates.
I'm Lisa Mullins.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarty.
I'm Jeremy Hobson.
This is 90.9 WBUR Boston.
Hello, welcome. How many people, this is your first time here? My name is Amy McDonald. I program this space. It's killing me. I like to call it the 92nd Street Y of Boston. We're doing author interviews, panel discussions on important issues, debates, music, coffeehouse opera, dance, live podcasts, moth story slams, cooking. It's everything. So go to our website, wbur.org/cityspace. Previously, there was a slide up here about how to sign up via email. Did anyone do that with their phone? It's the first night we did an experiment. Well, we'll keep trying. There's a kiosk outside as you're leaving with a little iPad. Please give us your email. Get on the list. You can see what's coming up. We are completely booked in June. We just opened February 28th. We do 4 to 5 events every week. So it's very exciting. It's really, isn't it beautiful? And it's quiet, and it's such a streetscape. And anyway, we are so proud. This was Carrie Goldberg's introduction to Annie and John. Carrie Goldberg is a host of Common Health, and we thought this was a perfect event for City Space. It was intimate, and it's humane, and welcome the panel.
Should we use the, okay, hello. Welcome. I'm John Adler, and this is Annie Brewster. We're here from Health Story Collaborative, and we're so happy to have you here tonight. We're going to say a little introductory remarks, and then we will get to the stories. So welcome. So we're here tonight to craft a story. Yes, I know you thought you were here to hear stories, and you are. I promise this won't be a surprise, immersive theater experience as much as I love those. And yes, we are also here tonight to celebrate these two amazing individuals, Mike and Genevieve, whose individual stories are forever intertwined. This is starting to sound like a wedding ceremony, which it's not. But as you know, Mike and Genevieve's stories are about an organ, a kidney, traveling from one body to another. And as you'll hear, and as anyone who's had any significant interaction with the medical system can attest, much more than a few pounds of tissue traveled between these two people. So we call these events healing story sessions because the very act of sharing these stories irrevocably changes them. The crafting of the story is healing in one way, but the sharing of it is also healing. So you're very much a part of that tonight. So we've held these sessions in a huge variety of places, from small private living rooms to medical school classrooms to big public events like this. But however many people are there in attendance, they become characters in the stories that we are creating here together. So yes, you're here to listen to Mike and Genevieve's stories, but by playing that role, you're also helping to shape their stories. This moment of storytelling and story receiving will inevitably be a new story in Mike and Genevieve's continually unfolding narratives. So thank you so much for joining us in this night of shared narration.
Hi, so my name's Annie Brewster. I'm just going to give you a little background just for the sake of context to give you a sense of sort of how we got here and why we're doing this work. So I am an internal medicine doctor myself. I work at Mass General Hospital and used to work in primary care and now work in urgent care. I'm also a patient myself, so I was diagnosed with MS 18 years ago now, so a long time. And so my passion for this work really has come out of my experience navigating the healthcare system, both as a patient and as a doctor, and really learning firsthand what I feel is sort of broken with the system from those two perspectives. And really what I've come to over the years is that we aren't making enough time in healthcare for sharing stories and for really active listening and connecting. And I felt this as a patient, just not being really seen and heard or feeling understood. And I felt as a physician, the inability to connect with my patients for various reasons, like lack of time and just the structure of the system as it is. So there are a lot of constraints which make it challenging, I think, both for patients and doctors. And I think the way it is that it makes for a dissatisfying system for both, with patients feeling overlooked, not seen, not heard, not understood, and physicians and other providers feeling hassled, harassed, and burned out. And there's a huge problem with physician burnout right now. So in 2010, in an effort to really fill that void, I started collecting patient stories and then really saw sort of the healing power in that, both for the listeners of the stories and for the tellers and sharers of those narratives, and then founded Health Story Collaborative out of that. So we're a nonprofit organization. John has been working with me since the beginning pretty much, and he's sort of the research expert, and he'll tell you a bit about the research behind the health benefits of storytelling. And so we base a lot of our programming on that, and all of our programs are really focused on trying to create a space for story sharing within healthcare in a really intentional way. And you have to be intentional about it because it's not going to happen in the 15-minute or 20-minute doctor visit. There are certainly things we can do in those visits to make people feel more listened to, but we really want to create intentional spaces for that to happen. And so the Healing Story Sessions is one of these models. And I just want to say as the background that it's not easy. These two storytellers up here have spent a lot of time really digging into their stories, and that takes effort, and it's vulnerable, and we go through lots of revisions and aim to help them come up with a narrative that feels really authentic and empowering, and also makes for a story that we can all resonate with in some ways, or that we can find overlaps in our own lives. So I just want to say, kudos to them, because it takes a lot of courage to engage in this and to be up here sharing, and it's really a gift to all of us. So our goals for tonight are, first and foremost, to make this a therapeutic experience for them. So we know that dealing with illness can be destabilizing, and that can be true for patients' loved ones. And the process of sort of working on crafting our narratives around these things can help us find meaning and coherence in that. So that is therapeutic, and that's part of our intention. Also, to give them an opportunity to be witnessed and to stand up here and really have the stage and be listened to, because that's something that we sometimes are denied in healthcare. And then as audience members, your job is really just to be present and to be supportive. And we hope to tap into the shared humanity that you hear, and to think of overlaps in your own life, and to think about your own stories and the process, and to bear witness to these brave individuals up here. So they're really the talent of the night, although I was very excited to walk through the door that said talent only. I've never done that before. So, but they're really the heroes of the evening. So I'm going to turn it back over to John for a minute, and he'll tell you a little bit about how this evening will run and about his own work.
Okay, thanks, Annie. So I'm an academic clinical psychologist. I work at Olin College of Engineering in Needham, and my research really focuses on the ways in which telling stories about our lives allows us to constitute a sense of self. I'm particularly interested in stories of challenging experiences and the ways in which those stories can support our well-being. So I've worked with Annie over the years to sort of harness the body of scientific research on narrative to inform the programs that we've developed and run at Health Story Collaborative. So as you may or may not know, there's sort of a growing movement in academic clinical medicine, something that sometimes broadly gets called the medical humanities, or more narrowly, narrative medicine. And Annie and I are huge fans of that work. We think it has been and will continue to be a major force for good. But the work that we do also stands alongside that tradition, because rather than only marshaling the tools from the arts and humanities, we're also recruiting tools from the social sciences. So stories are subjective reconstructions, but we can use the tools of science to study them, to try to understand the ways in which they work for us or don't work so much for us. And that scientific understanding ought to be especially useful for doctors, but also for patients and loved ones, all of us who are deeply engaged in the messy process of using science to support health. So although you won't see much of it tonight, we wanted you to know that a lot of the work that we've done that's sort of gotten us to tonight's event is actually deeply grounded in the science of narrative. Okay, so here's how tonight is going to work. First, we're going to hear from Mike, who will tell you his story. Then we'll hear from Genevieve. And then after that, we'll see if the storytellers have anything they want to say in response to each other's stories, because they haven't heard them before in this form the way they will tonight. And then after that, we'll open it up for question and answer, discussion. Please feel free to ask questions. Please feel free to answer or not answer any questions that you don't want to. And then finally, when we finish up, we have a basket out in the lobby with cards there for you to, if you want to leave a note for either or both of our storytellers, just to give them something tangible to take with them after tonight, and also to give you a chance to give back in that way. Okay, so thank you again for joining us this evening. Now we'll turn it over to Mike, who had a kidney transplant on October 25th of 2018.
Move it up, yeah. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I think sometimes as humans, we like to think we have more control over our lives than we really do. We go about our days confidently making decisions as if we're in charge, but many of the situations we encounter are out of our control. Anyone here who has experienced significant health problems knows this all too well. My own experiences with polycystic kidney disease have often left me feeling powerless and wondering if there is much of anything we do have control over. So I thought I was healthy for much of my childhood and young adulthood. I grew up in the picturesque part of northern New Jersey, surrounded mostly by mountains and cows, which is far from the smoggy turnpike part and the trashy but endearing kind of trashy part of the Jersey Shore from MTV. I spent my childhood playing the saxophone, loving school, never pumped my own gas because in New Jersey you don't. And then I moved here in 2002 for college, to this very street, in fact, to Boston University, where I studied biology and education. I went to grad school across the river at Harvard, and then I started teaching and met Genevieve. I've been teaching high school biology, marine biology, and chemistry at the same high school for the past 12 years, except for last year where I took a sabbatical to work at NASA in Washington, D.C. I came back from NASA to get a kidney. That wasn't a laugh point, actually, but that was true. That was true. So you see, I was diagnosed 6 years ago with polycystic kidney disease. We also call that PKD. It's a genetic condition where as time goes on, your kidneys lose their ability to filter your blood. It eventually leads to total kidney failure and then ultimately death. I found out that I had PKD as somewhat of a fluke. We had no family history of it, and patients don't usually show symptoms until your kidneys fail and it's too late. One symptom is high blood pressure, and I did have that in my early 20s, but my doctor chalked it up to family history and just put me on an ACE inhibitor to keep that at bay. I went to the emergency room on the eve of my 28th birthday. Something wasn't right. I had arm pain, I had chest pain, shortness of breath. WebMD said I was having a heart attack, so I went to the hospital. It wasn't a heart attack, but they did say the symptoms were something abnormal in the blood. We should run some more tests. I protested because the next day was my birthday, and I had dinner reservations at Oleana in Cambridge, right? Right, yeah. So the doctor insisted that I stay overnight for testing, and I did. And one kidney ultrasound later, the characteristic cysts of PKD were visible, and I was officially diagnosed. That high blood pressure that I'd been treating is actually a classic symptom of PKD. Luckily, the diagnosis and the discharge came before dinner, and it was delicious. The next few years were marked by semi-annual nephrologist visits, and they largely went the same each time. A slight decrease in my kidney filtration rate, which is bad, an ominous warning about the eventual transplant I would need, and then we booked an appointment for 6 months later to come back. Then the appointments became every 3 months and then every 2 months. I actually really liked my nephrologist. He was personable, compassionate. He talked to me like an educated person. He knew that I was reading about my disease, but in primary literature, not on WebMD. These visits were emotionally draining, though, because his recommendations and diagnoses sounded overly serious for how healthy I felt at the time. I didn't feel like a sick person, and I think sometimes healthy people don't really know, and I felt healthy at the time, what it really means to be a sick person. We spend time with family members in the hospital, or we see stories on Facebook about, children in hospital beds with IVs, a woman wearing a bandana to cover her head that has just gone bald from chemotherapy. Like, that's a sick person. I just had high blood pressure and maybe cysts on my kidneys. So this was hard. As time went on, I did start to feel physical symptoms. As my kidneys became less able to filter my blood filled with junk, and that made me tired all the time. I also had a few flare-ups of gout, which is a type of arthritis that could be caused by kidney disease and other things. I spent my summer teaching in Hong Kong at the time, and the long flights started to become very arduous as my feet and legs would swell on the plane. My last trip to Hong Kong in 2017 was nothing short of a cluster. My feet were so incredibly swollen that I couldn't wear shoes. I ended up in a Hong Kong emergency room and then had to teach on crutches for a few days. I knew at this point that a transplant was imminent. I just hoped I could postpone it indefinitely. And I knew I was compartmentalizing my illness. But that was still pretty easy to do because aside from these flare-ups, it seemed like things were pretty normal. The doctor said my kidneys would ultimately fail. Could be a year, could be 10 years, or it could be after my natural death. They really didn't know. And part of that uncertainty came from something called my GFR, which stands for glomerular filtration rate. This is an indication of how well your kidneys are filtering your blood, and a normal healthy GFR would be like 59 or greater. And mine was hovering in my 20s, the mid-20s for a while. I knew that once it dropped below 20 as a number, I could be listed on the National Kidney Registry. And that finally happened in January of 2017, and then it definitely seemed real. What I didn't know at the time, though, was that I'd have to wait many years for a kidney, because in Massachusetts, if you have type O blood, like I do, that's great if you want to donate blood to someone or donate an organ, because type O blood is that universal donor that people hear about. But when you are type O yourself, I could only have a kidney from another type O person, and that was a 4 to 5 year wait in Massachusetts at the time. So I needed to look for a living donor. If my kidneys were to fail before finding a living donor, I'd have to go on dialysis or I would die. Dialysis is crappy. It takes a huge physical toll on your body. It requires hours of treatment 3 days a week. It limits your ability to travel, to live a normal, healthy life, to live an independent life. And it's also not a permanent solution because if you stop dialysis, you will ultimately die. I didn't want to live like that in my early 30s, certainly not. So I started looking for a kidney among family members. Unfortunately, there were no healthy blood type O matches in my family. And this was frustrating because I had a lot of family members who wanted to donate, but they couldn't. After a year of looking and waiting, I went on social media in January of 2018. The results on Facebook were totally overwhelming. So I had a viral Facebook post, and it was shared by friends, it was shared by colleagues, former students. With all of the shares, there were over 60 people who just had type O blood who submitted information to MGH to be willing donors, which was just fantastic. The hospital can't tell me and couldn't tell me at the time the names of those people because of privacy laws, but people told me themselves, and it was friends and it was colleagues, former students, parents of students, former classmates that I went to high school with, parishioners from my parents' church. A lot of generous and brave people stepped forward. Now, Genevieve here, I met 12 years ago. We teach at the same school, and though our classrooms were on opposite sides of the building at the time because she taught English and I was teaching biology, we had become good friends through a number of things. One of them was we co-advised the student council together for a long time. We would chaperone dances until late in the evening. Yeah, right. We worked as building reps for the teachers union, and we would serve on committees together. One of those committees that I fondly remember was the mission statement committee. We were charged with rewriting our school's mission statement. I had some pretty eloquent suggestions, which is surprising for a science teacher. So eloquent that she labeled me a wordsmith at the time, and that's high praise coming from an English teacher. All of my mission statement suggestions were not taken. They were ignored. But still to today, that's one of the nicest compliments anyone's ever given me. And it turns out that this friend here, this wordsmith person who called me a wordsmith, saw my Facebook post, and after months of testing that she went through, we turned out to be a very close kidney match as well, not just close friends. And she was not even willing, but excited to donate a kidney to me. I remember the conversation we had, and it was a great text conversation. It's like we were trying to figure out a coffee date. So it's, when are we going to have this transplant? And I said summer, and she was like, well, I have a trip plan. Let's go for fall. And, we should at least start the school year and get it rolling. How about October? And she was like, oh, there's a wedding the second week of October. So we went back and forth, and we settled on October 25th of this past year. And 7 months ago, almost to today. Yeah. The transplant itself was definitely scary. I remember that day pretty vividly. I showed up to the perioperative area at 8 a.m., changed into this ugly blue gown that people are familiar with, met a lot of faces I would see over the course of the day. I had to stop eating the night before and stop drinking at 7 a.m. that morning. So I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was hangry, I was nervous. And to add to my unease, I was told that I'd be able to see Genevieve that morning, and then that didn't happen. Our paths didn't cross. So I was very frustrated by this, and I knew she was going to be going under the knife first because they had to take her kidney out before they could open me up. By 9:30, I was wheeled through the bowels of the hospital to the operating room. My anesthesiologist was wearing a Red Sox skull cap, which I thought was wicked Boston, and great to see. There were a ton of scissors in the operating room, which I remember as well. But I was told they weren't all for me. I don't know who they were for. This is actually one of the last things that I remember because I was unconscious before they even put the oxygen mask on me. I didn't get to count backwards, which I'm still disappointed about because that's what everyone says is, count back from 10. I woke up at 7 p.m. I was in my recovery room. I didn't feel a lot of pain at first because of drugs, but I also didn't feel great also because of drugs. I was told the kidney was working well, though, and my urine was beautiful. And I think after the wordsmith thing, that was the second best compliment anyone has ever given me. I knew that Genevieve was on the same floor, but I wouldn't be able to see her until the next day. And I remember feeling incredibly grateful walking over to see her. It was a hard walk, so I had a big incision. I had a catheter in. I was hooked up to IVs. I was in pain, but I was relieved that it was over, and it was incredible to see someone. And I felt this closeness to her that I hadn't felt before during our friendship or even leading up to the transplant. Her recovery was pretty fast, and it was such a positive light for me to see. Whenever I'd go walk around the hallway, she would be there practically jogging around the hallway. Mine was a little bit more bumpy. The kidney they removed was pretty large. It was pretty inflamed, so they had to take out much more tissue than they anticipated. I developed what they call an ileus, which is the shutting down of my digestive system. So I started vomiting. They had to put a tube in through my nose that went down into my stomach. I couldn't eat, but the tube had sucked up over a liter of disgusting stuff that was in there. I don't think I've ever felt that physically miserable before, not necessarily pain, just lots of misery and discomfort. Hurt to sleep, it hurt to move, I couldn't eat anything. And then I was also allergic to one of the medicines that they prescribed me, so I had hives too. And then I had a gout attack after that. So it was a lot, but the victories were pretty great. You forget what an accomplishment something like a catheter removal is. I was discharged a week later, and that was on Halloween. I remember getting a small cup of M&Ms from MGH on the day of Halloween, and then we watched the Red Sox parade with my parents on TV because that was on. I was relieved to finally be home, and my parents were there to help me recover, though that was a slow and difficult recovery. But then more of those small victories, things like taking a shower or going to the bathroom without any pain, walking, then finally sleeping through the night. Then I was able to lift groceries on my own a few months later. Then I could go out in public without as much of a threat of an immune system compromised there. I was able to go back to work 3 months later. And today, 7 months or almost 7 months after, I feel like a normal, healthy person. The regimen of anti-rejection drugs that I'm on is very manageable, much more than I thought it would be. And then the blood work and follow-up visits were up to every 3 months now, where it used to be daily when I was in the hospital. So it's unbelievable. My immune system is compromised, but even that has noticeably regained strength from right after the transplant. So I do notice a positive physical improvement, and my attitude has improved. I do feel like, as people say, I have a new lease on life, but what does that mean? It means that I have a chance to live a long, healthy, productive life, and that wouldn't have been possible without Genevieve. I feel like that I have a responsibility now to help other patients use resources like social media to find a donor for themselves. I recently spoke on a panel at MGH to a group of pre-transplant recipients, and I continue to volunteer for the National Kidney Foundation walks. And I'd like to share that my transplant and associated costs were in excess of $300,000. But because I have good health care, I paid less than $2,000. So I feel that many Americans don't have this luxury, but it shouldn't be a luxury, it should be a right. And that's something that now I want to fight for more. Genevieve and I have been using our platform as teachers to spread awareness about living organ donation as well. People have asked me if it's weird to see her. And actually, yeah. And some friends have even said, don't use a donor that's a friend. Find a donor who you don't know because you don't want to see them afterwards. What if something goes wrong? It would be awkward. I'm already awkward, so it would be even more awkward. Would I feel forever indebted to her? In fact, though, it's one of the greatest blessings to see her walking down the hallway at school. Colleagues will share how special it is to see us together and how it gives them hope. We have our photograph in the yearbook, which just came out last week. And part of the reason is because we inspired the students that we teach. And it's a pretty special feeling knowing that she so selflessly saved my life, but now I get to share this bond with her, and most people don't have a close bond, even with good friends, that involves a transfer of an organ. I definitely feel that greater sense of responsibility, and I'm trying to do something good with this opportunity that she gave me. I think that's why opportunities like this have to be shared. And because I can share the story, I must share our story. It's hard to thank someone who donates. I can't look at her. It's hard to thank someone who donates an organ to you. It's hard to find the right words to say, even when you're a wordsmith like I am. My gratitude there, though, is in many forms. The occasional text asking her if she wants coffee, or the smile when I see her in the break room across from our department center, sitting there doing work. The messages of reassurance that I can share with other people who haven't yet had their transplant, that things are going to be okay. And even the interactions with family and friends, knowing that I can spend many more healthy years with them. I never would have known a decade ago that those student council dances or teacher meetings, that we would have this future bond that we would share. But I think that's the essence of this human experience. We can't control many aspects of our own health or predict what the future holds, but we can, however, cultivate friendships with random people at work. We can express gratitude to those who help us along. We can share hardships and experiences with the people around us, especially those going through similar health challenges. We can also never really know what hardships our friends and colleagues might be facing in their personal lives, so we can just generally practice empathy and patience when we deal with other people. We can be grateful for the things we can control, and we can be grateful for the challenges that we don't have to face. Most importantly, we can share our stories, and in doing so, we are able to reshape our perspectives on life and the importance of the relationships we forge in it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's too tall for me. Now we're going to hear from Genevieve, and then we'll get to talk to both of them.
That's a heady experience to hear. We haven't heard each other. We didn't share any of what we wrote in advance. We were asked not to, and I think that's great. It leaves me a little lightheaded, though, I will say. So, technically, my story begins with health, not illness. As a prospective kidney donor, the whole point was for me to be as healthy as possible, and I was. But there was something wrong with me that day in January 2018 when I scrolled through Facebook to find my colleague, Mike Romano, telling us that having been diagnosed with polycystic kidney disease, he now found himself asking the difficult question, was there anyone in his orbit who would be willing to consider donating a kidney to him? Excuse me. What felt difficult to him to ask felt immediately, unquestionably, and profoundly right to me to answer in the affirmative. Because despite having general good health, the right blood type, and 2 kidneys that seemed to function quite well, I did have an affliction that weighed on me. I believe that my subconscious soul recognized in this kidney journey the possibility of beginning to heal my heart, which had broken just 2 months before, on November 5th, 2017, when I found my mother dead on the floor of her house. In the shock and emptiness I had felt since that day, I nevertheless spied something in the possibility of organ donation that might fill me again with peace. My mother, Yvonne, was diagnosed with cancer in her tonsils in late October of 2016 at age 79, just 4 months after the death of her husband of nearly 30 years, my stepfather, Jim. The year between her diagnosis and her death featured the full array of treatments at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, including both chemotherapy and radiation. Because of the intensity of the 8-week course of treatment and because of the severity of its effects, my mother was continuously either hospitalized at the Brigham and Women's Hospital or in one of 3 different rehab facilities for more than 3 months. My brother Henry and I, her only children, spent much of our time with her at appointments and treatment sessions in hospitals and nursing homes so that she wouldn't be alone. I was stunned when I joined her for a chemo session for the first time, as the nurse who was administering the drug arrived wrapped in double layers of gowns to protect herself from even touching the very substance that was about to be dripped into my mother's veins. Even in May 2017, when the oncologist declared her cured of the cancer, she was still stripped of her ability to eat. So the feeding tube that had been installed months before had to remain in place as she slowly retrained herself to consume food, even when it tasted wrong and metallic and miserable in her burned out throat. We grew up here in Brookline, Mass. My mother worked as an administrator at Harvard Medical School and at the Brigham for many years. So it was an article of faith that we were lucky to live in this part of the country. It was like a talisman, I now see, one of the charms of what I think I thought of as my charmed life. Not perfect, not without sadness or failure or misfortune, but happy underneath it all. The day in November 2016 when Henry and I joined our mother at the Farber when Dr. Rabinowitz told her that they had found cancer on her tonsils and adjacent lymph nodes, it was bad. But we were in the place that people come to from everywhere in the world to be treated for these things. This was a place with a head and neck cancer floor. In the way that the radiation team targeted her cancer within millimeters with their fierce rays, that's how focused these people were on specific types of cancer. What I would learn is that no matter how targeted the radiation, the physical pain would spread just as malignantly as the disease that was being attacked. The cancer doctors were so focused, in fact, that I believe it kept them from being able to see my mother as she was, fragile and stoic, terrified and alone in a fundamental way for the first time in more than 30 years. Different people at different facilities kept asking the same questions about where she lived and with whom and whether she was married. That seemed wrong in a way I couldn't exactly identify, but that I felt in my heart. The events of February 3rd, 2017 captured this dissonance for me perfectly. It was the last day of 8 weeks of 5 days a week of radiation, and at this point she was inpatient at the Brigham's Cancer Center for Excellence. When I arrived, I found her very confused about what was happening to her, not the first time I had encountered her in this state. She was in tears and she wanted me to go into the treatment room with her, which was not permitted. Eventually, we were able to reassure her that it was okay and no one was going to hurt her. And when she came out 20 minutes later, one of the two nurses who had followed her case came to say goodbye and asked us to wait a minute before returning to her floor on the Brigham. The nurse came back momentarily with a bubble gun that she used to fill the area with bubbles in a celebration of the end of the course of radiation. She couldn't have been kinder or had better intentions, and I even took pictures of the three of us. But all I see when I look at them now is a film of smiles over the ocean of my mother's agony and a kind of willful misunderstanding of that moment in a cancer patient's treatment. That bubblegum celebration glossed over what was actually going to happen as the effects of the chemicals and burning reverberated through my mother's frail body. So all of this time in medical and medicine-adjacent places left me confused about what the words treatment and cure and healing meant. And even while I was grateful to have these world-class facilities available to her, I couldn't help question, as the months went on, whether any of the dozens of people who interacted with her really cared about her in a way that would lead her back to authentic good health. Just like the nurse in radiation, everyone we met individually was kind and smart and knew their stuff, but each was only treating one aspect of the illness. And it was all so big and terrifying that I could never find the right way to ask the right question of the right person. I just wanted her to be okay. By July 2017, she was finally home, living on her own again, and I felt like I could breathe and let those questions go. The summer passed, she got used to her feeding tube routine, and she seemed less anxious back in her own familiar space. Then came the November Sunday when I arrived at her house and found her dead, and all those questions ballooned into my own shrieks of pain and confusion and heartbreak. We'll never know what happened to her, though we suspect internal bleeding following the removal of her feeding tube. Maybe her heart gave out. Maybe some other harm from her treatment played a role, or her age. But her death had a serious effect for me beyond the personal crushing loss of a mother who offered me unconditional love for all of the 54 years we had together. It also caused me to falter in my belief in these medical practices and practitioners and institutions. So this was my frame of mind when I saw Mike's post about his need for a kidney. In the moment, I only really registered two things. I had the right blood type, and I like to fill out forms. So I went on the MGH screening site and I completed forms to my heart's content. I honestly never thought I'd be chosen as a donor. I thought for sure my middle age or general overweightness or a million other things would eliminate me. It is deeply out of this world to consider yourself as a potential organ donor. As you know, we've known each other for more than 10 years since he joined me at AB. He teaches science and I taught English at the time, and our fields are opposites in a lot of the ways that many high schools operate, including ours, where they're on different sides of the building. But we've had many students in common, and I have learned from them that he has a gift for inspiring a love of science, its processes and discoveries and possibilities. We have co-advised the school student council and chaperoned proms together. It's not as much fun the 12th time. We've served together on union boards where my urge to placate has balanced against his willingness to engage in the fight. Early in his career, we were two of the final three competitors in a student-run spelling bee, remember? And I was crushed when his deep knowledge of fancy Latin science words took me out. I am in awe of his skills with language and communication, in addition to his enthusiasm and curiosity in his chosen field. And I can say now that I've always felt a kind of big sister affection for him. I will never forget getting the email just before February vacation of 2018 saying I was a potential match. I was sitting at my desk in my classroom, and it actually did feel like being struck by lightning. I had a sense of being suddenly lifted above my misery, deposited in a place where death and my grief could recede and the possibilities of life became manifest. After feeling frustrated and sidelined during my mother's treatment and ultimately mystified by her death, it seemed suddenly possible that I could move to the center of a life-saving story. I called Mike right away in Washington, where he was spending a sabbatical year as an Einstein Fellow working at NASA. It never occurred to me not to tell him that I was a possible match in case I might have wanted to change my mind, because I knew, without knowing why, that there was never a question of changing my mind. I was a little bit giddy during that call, telling him that I would be scheduled for a battery of tests before learning whether I could actually donate or not. I think we were both stunned that after a literal worldwide response to his initial post, his potential donor could be down the hall in the West Wing of the high school. He assured me that his need for a new kidney was urgent in the within 6 to 8 months sense and not the next week during February vacation sense, and I relaxed. Every step of the testing held an odd kind of thrill for me. I can now see that the whole process mirrored in some ways my experience with my mother's treatment. As the donor, I had my own team of professionals, separate from the recipient's team. I was the focus of attention of a group of people dedicated to one goal, making sure that I was fit for a major surgery and its aftermath. In a way, they had the same intensity of focus as the oncologists and radiologists who had treated my mother. But the expertise of each member of my team seemed to be integrated instead of exclusive. I met with my nurse, Kelly, and my social worker, Judy. And each of them took great pains and time to make sure I knew what to expect and to learn about me and my story. Even parts of my life outside the Mass General were folded into the process. When I met with the psychiatrist on the team and I told him that I was talking to my own therapist about the possibility of transplant, he asked if I would allow him to speak with her. I agreed, and I felt buoyed by the idea that he was taking such care. I did a series of respiratory tests to determine my lung capacity because I did smoke for 18 years, though I quit in 1998. It felt as though I started the process feeling mildly good about my own health, and by the time I got to surgery in October, I felt like Superwoman. I should talk about what passed between me and Mike in this time. The testing began in March of 2018 and proceeded through the end of June. I checked in with him periodically, though we were both incredibly busy and several states apart at the time. We haven't made a habit of hanging out or really socializing. There's a significant difference in our ages. We're close as colleagues, but if I eventually gave him my kidney, it would not be because of a deep personal bond going into it. I think this was something that confused people when I first started talking about the possibility of organ donation. When I said that the possible recipient wasn't a relative or an intimate friend, I could sense people's mystification and even concern. I couldn't really explain it myself, this bubbling elation I felt whenever I imagined hearing that we were a go for donation. I just knew I didn't want to let it go. My social worker, Judy, raised the question in reverse during the testing period. We talked about how I would feel if I got a no from Kelly, or what I would do to manage that feeling, how I would even prepare for the call itself when it came, regardless of the verdict. I told her I would be devastated if I couldn't donate, though in truth, this felt like it was more about me than about Mike. I had seen the worldwide Facebook response. I knew how much he meant to so many people. I couldn't imagine that another donor wouldn't be found. When I examined this potential no from Kelly, I simply felt as if something would be taken from me, which is ironic since that no meant that I would keep something over here. Again, I couldn't explain it, but I just hoped I didn't sound too zealous to be a good donor. We also agreed that if I saw Kelly's name on an incoming call, I should probably sit down. And then there it was. Kelly called me in June after the kidney team had met, just as she said she would. I took a seat, as I had promised Judy I would. And as you know, it was a yes. The relief, the excitement, the surrealness of it all exploded in me. Kelly asked if I wanted to be the one to tell Mike, and to be able to do that felt like another gift. We agreed that Mike and I would start to think about potential surgery dates after she said what felt like the weirdest thing. We do these transplant surgeries on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so keep that in mind when picking dates. I texted Mike to see if he was free and asked him to call me if he was. I don't remember the exact words that passed between us, but it was a very good vibe on that line from Needham to Washington, D.C. We didn't talk long in the end, past starting to look at that school calendar in the fall. I knew that this surgery and its aftermath were much more complicated for Mike than for me. I was desperate for my kidney to work for him, but even if it didn't, I would very likely come out of the surgery relatively unscathed. He had many more reasons to hesitate, while I felt nothing but full steam ahead. As August ticked along and we hadn't picked a date yet, I started to worry that he might not want to go through with it, or that he might prefer a donation from a stranger. It's weird that he said that too. Rather than being tied to me in this way for the rest of his life. Finally, on August 27th, I wrote him an email, which included the following, quote, "The only other thing is to tell you how profoundly happy this process makes me and how incredibly lucky I feel to be able to do this with you. I don't know if that sounds ridiculously saccharine or hard to believe, but I swear to you it's the whole unmitigated truth. It makes me happy to think I'll have a connection to you in this way, but I don't want you to think that possession of my kidney will lead to any possessive stalking on my part. Once it's yours, it's all yours. And if you want to take it around the world on a binge when you turn 40, have at it." End quote. I read this now, and the intensity of how much I wanted this to work floods me. I literally could not wait to give something of myself, of my own body, and I felt lucky at the prospect of an entirely voluntary, deeply invasive surgical procedure. I couldn't explain my motivation then any better, but as I have been writing this piece, it has started to come into greater focus. Soon after, we texted some possibilities back and forth, as we like to say, like you'd schedule a coffee date, and eventually settled on a Thursday, October 25th. When that day came, I felt not one instant of pain or fear, but instead a kind of stillness and peace. From my bed in the pre-op unit, I could see the electronic board listing various surgeries. In the TV medical shows, it's a messy whiteboard, but this was a beautifully intelligent screen. And I realized that all the surgeries were inching to the left along a timeline. Even without my distance glasses, I could just make out kidney transplant on the board, and I zeroed in on that entry until it met its destination time of 10 a.m. I also remember thinking, it's a good thing I started taking anti-anxiety medication 20 years ago. As if in preparation for this very moment. Back then, I would have been drenched in dread instead of the peaceful anticipation of today. If I leave you with anything, let it be an endorsement for good mental health care. Our surgeries having crossed the line, it was time to go. I was wheeled to the very, very bright operating room, told that the mask would smell like a beach ball, started to count backwards, I think I got to 8, and I was out. And then 2 seconds later, seemingly, I was back. If you've never had surgery, as I never had, you should be aware that it's not like sleeping. There are no dreams, there's no sense of any time passing at all. It seems quite inconceivable that anything could have happened in the few seconds that you were out. But of course, it wasn't seconds, it was hours. At least 4 hours, and someone was pushing their knuckles into my chest to wake me up, and all I remember saying as I opened my eyes was, "Did it work? Is it working?" I needed to know if my kidney was functioning inside Mike, and they told me right away that it was. I had no more words, but I was happy to be rolled to a room on the same floor where Mike would eventually also arrive, though his surgery took longer. People want to know about everything I had to go through, the restrictions I must have had or still have on what I eat or drink, or whether I feel different being down a kidney. But the truth is, from the very first hours of recovery, it was just not that big a deal. This might have been influenced by the fact that my roommate for most of my 2 nights at the Mass General was a heart transplant recipient who had many, many woes. So my situation paled in comparison. I was uncomfortable, to be sure. The particulars of expelling the gas used to inflate my belly so that Dr. Daggerford could reach in with her exquisitely small hands through the incision around my belly button to extract my left kidney, I'll leave them to your imagination. I couldn't roll onto either side, and lying on your back is a drag after a while. My husband, Dan, no fan of hospitals, stayed with me, and my brother and sister-in-law, Henry and Mimi, arrived from the waiting area, where it turned out that they had met and bonded with Karen and Angelo, Mike's parents. And nothing about my diet has changed, nothing about the way my body functions has changed, and from the moment I woke up, I was and remain in awe, filled with relief and joy. And here we are now, I would say exactly 7 months from the day, since it is a Thursday, of the surgery. Whenever someone comments on what I did, the only thing I can ever say is how lucky I feel to have been able to do it. I've said it reflexively, and for a long time, I thought it was because I got to be the person who makes such a difference in the life of another person. But in telling this story, I've been pushed to unpack what I really mean by that, at first just to myself, and now to all of you. Quite simply, the luckiest thing about this adventure was that it came at the exact moment when I needed to be rescued from the very worst reality by the very best possibility. I needed to be able to focus on my own body and what it was capable of so that I could get out of the overwhelming sadness that was overtaking my head and my heart. Being one of 68 living donors in 2018 at the Mass General was the opposite in every way of being one of thousands of patients at the Dana-Farber, which had been my mother's plight. When I was wrestling with the work of writing this story, Annie drew my attention to something that's a little bit raw, but I can't get the image out of my head. I told you that we think that the removal of my mother's feeding tube might have contributed to her death. It's a common enough procedure, the tube being yanked out a little abruptly, as she described it to us that night, and almost never dangerous. And yet there she was the next day, dead on the floor. I told this to Annie, and after a pause, she pointed out that I also had had something removed from my body, but with care and thought and intention. And not only am I here to tell this story, but as importantly, so is Mike. Thank you.
Is it on? Okay. Thank you guys so much. That was incredibly wonderful to hear from both of you. So take a minute, but as Genevieve and Mike both said, they have not heard each other tell these stories before. So of course they know the stories on some level, but we would all be interested, I think, to know what it felt like to witness the other person share this story, or what it felt like to stand here and share it with the audience here and with the other one of you here.
Still processing,
still processing for sure. Yeah.
It's a lot to process.
It felt good. It felt good. It feels good to get it out. And just the process of writing this story has been very, very healing for me. And I'm even more grateful now that I'm as cognizant. And also hearing from you makes it less about me. And which I know it's about, but I mean, so much of it, as you've heard, was about like what I was going through and how could I kind of escape. And it's, Mike didn't seem sick, so it wasn't like rushing in to save someone when they had been hit by a car or something. It was like, he seemed great. I did this thing. He still seems great. Like, he's private. You're private. And I think I didn't understand how much the PKD had been affecting him. And so hearing that and again, just thinking, one more thing. one thing I learned right before the surgery, feels like right before, was that because our DNA is different, that PKD will never go to my kidney, which is amazing, right? So I'm just so, again, still just so grateful and in awe that we're able to do it. Yeah.
And on the DNA piece, so I'm a medical chimera now, in the sense that it's a rare number of people who have two totally separate DNAs inside of their body. So like the biologist in me thinks that's really cool. But I appreciate how you talked about the idea of, and I hadn't really thought about it this way, you know, at the Brigham, at MGH, there are thousands of procedures happening over the course of a year. And so if you think about every single procedure has one or two people that each have their own story, that I think the power of sharing stories like this is it makes you think about how we're unique, but also in that same way, every single person who was in the hospital that day in the 50 operating rooms besides ours also have their own story. And I think that's very powerful.
Agree. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So we'd love to open it up to all of you to ask questions, share your reactions, see connections between their stories. So will someone bravely get us started?
And I think what we'll do is if someone has a question, I think that the protocol is you're supposed to come up to this mic here.
Unless you're willing to talk
or
really
if you
loud.
can't get up, we can also come and pass this around. So.
And we're both teachers, so we're great at wait time.
Right, exactly.
All right, why don't we pass it?
Yeah, we'll walk these down. So don't be shy.
Just raise your hand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Here we go.
Thank you. So I'm impressed with how deep and honest you've been in front of, 60 or 70 people. And I'm wondering if there's something about the experience that makes you willing to be more vulnerable and put yourself out there. And that's a difficult thing to do, and it takes a lot of strength. So I'm just curious about, are you the type of people that go around talking about these things all the time, or is this something that's come along with it?
Thank you for asking that.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Yeah, you go.
I think that part of it is realizing that while it is also deeply personal, there's also the ability to change, change the hearts of others, change the minds of others. One of the things that we had talked about earlier, months ago, was that we both approach, living organ donation from a very different pathway. I can share an experience with people who have to go through the same thing that I do and help make their experience easier. So a little bit of vulnerability on my part is easy compared to what the benefit could be. And then Genevieve's way of looking at it is, donating an organ is not the most difficult thing that you could do, So if people understood, if healthy people with two healthy kidneys understood how easy it could be, still incredible. But how
absolutely agree.
Like we can make some change by kind of looking at two different populations that both in our country need work and need help. And so I think at least for me, the small amount of personal vulnerability, is much less than the
agree. Yeah, I would agree. And I was struck. I mean, first of all, I have a tremendous support system, and many friends and loved ones and family are here, and so just knowing that helped me. We're also both like public talkers, so but I did find when I started to talk about it that people were really like, wow, he's not even like your brother, like what? You would give an organ? Like it was this mystical thing. And the whole idea of, is your diet restricted and all? Like if I can dispel those myths, it's definitely worth the vulnerability. And I also I don't know if others find as they get older, like embracing vulnerability feels great. And instead of shying away from it, the way we spend a lot of time with teenagers, and they're like constantly defended against everything, and just letting that go, just in itself feels good. So I'll just say that. Yeah.
Thank you. So first, I have to say this is absolutely amazing and just a beautiful thing. Thank you to all four of you, especially the two superheroes here. I will start off. I've just a couple of comments. I am a doctor, and I work with Annie, as does Jane. And just hearing your story, I mean, I've been practicing for many years, but hearing your story has profoundly changed how I think about organ donation right now. And I am a donor on my driver's license and everything, but it has profoundly changed it. So I want to thank you for that. And I also want to say, I'm struck with the intimacy of sharing an organ and sort of dealing with intimacy. I mean, it's really profoundly deep. I'm not sure where to go with that, and I'm not sure to go with the other piece, which is listening to you two has been healing for me. And I'm not even sure where it's coming from, but it has been healing for me to listen to you two. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can I just add one thing on that? I agree with you about that intimacy, and that's something we all sort of talked about in the story writing and revising process. And I pushed a lot on the metaphoric value of the kidney, and it didn't take us anywhere, right? Like the heart is this metaphorically laden organ with centuries of poetry about the heart, and we were sort of like, what is the kidney? What can we do with the kidney? And so it has that funny. It's more intimate than anything else. There's a part of you living in him. And yet, it doesn't get layered the way other parts of the body do. So I just think that's an interesting distinction. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jen's sister-in-law. And I just wanted to speak to the intimacy, because we were in that waiting room with where we met Karen and Angelo. And again, as I'm also a physician, I went up to the desk and I said, I know you can't tell me who they are, but just know that if they're here and they come to you, like we want to talk to them and meet them. And right away, I think Karen was like, we're here. So we spent, 2-3 hours. And it was just, again, it wasn't our organ, it wasn't their organ, but something about having this happening somewhere else with our loved ones. There was just an immediate, connection. It was uncanny. It's very powerful. The bittersweet or the sadness around this story for me is, and I'm gonna get emotional, is also just realizing how imperfect the system we work in is. You try to do the right thing. And then there's a deeper layer of, it's almost guilt, because I put in feeding tubes, although I don't put in those kind of tubes. We put in nice, gentle balloons that deflate and slip out, and this was a tube that had to get yanked out. But it's also just feeling a little sadness and guilt that, Yvonne was my mother-in-law, and somehow having failed her. So anyway, this is a wonderful, frosting on the cake of what was a very sort of traumatic, sudden, just awful end to someone who was cured of cancer, right?
Right.
And so, anyway, it's wonderful to hear it.
And I do want to say, I didn't mean to, as I was speaking it, and I've read this and spoken it and practiced, I didn't mean to draw such a, just like, Brigham versus Mass General or something like that, or even like cancer versus organ. I just, they were inextricably linked for me, but those people cared so much for Yvonne, and they really did, and they were devastated, as we were when what happened. So anyway, I just want to add that.
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your stories, and I think about charity a lot, and especially in this day and age, we need it. And so thank you again for that, because it really made my day to hear this. And just your bravery for talking about charity. I sort of feel a little bit selfish in doing it, because it makes me feel good.
Shouldn't.
But it makes me think, and I just think that you being so brave and confident and talking about it is fabulous. So thank you, and congratulations.
Hi, thank you all so much. First of all, Annie and John, thank you for the work that you do. And the value of time cannot even be labeled. I would never have an appreciation for either of your experiences if you didn't create the time for us tonight. Mm-hmm. And I'm a PDICU nurse, and I certainly have more time than physicians. However, I can be pulled in a million directions too, and frequently the quality of that time is absolutely suboptimal, and the privacy is suboptimal, and I don't know, it's something I struggle with always, so I really appreciate your work. And Mike, I don't even know what to say. I feel like you're my brother now. I'm like, okay, Superman, you can come home. But it was wonderful, wonderful to hear you, and you're so brave, especially being such a private person. You know, you're very, very brave, and the fact that you're at NASA fits perfectly. Just on sabbatical, you came home. But it was really, really good to hear from your perspective, and I can imagine, I have been a patient, not for an organ, but many times, and I know what that side is like, and as a nurse, I'm very glad I've been a patient numerous times. It's made me a much better nurse. So I'm glad that you can share that with prospective patients. And Jen, it was just incredible. I think there's something the universe does, God, a higher power, whatever, that took you from your incredible sadness and darkness to the possibility of hope. Yeah. The possibility, you know? And that you could also portray for us something that's really important for me, that everyone on your mom's path was kind. It's true. But they were segregated. Mm-hmm. And that you had a really corrective experience with the organ donation, that people were integrated, your team was integrated. Kelly was there, Judy was there, you know, the operating room person that didn't let you count to 10. Anyway, it was just, it makes me so sad. And there's all these specialties, like cancer's a sexy disease, and I hate to say that in a demoralizing way, but it also becomes a mill. And you were so tended to, and people took such great care and such time. Mm-hmm. And time is the essence right now for humanity, and I think it's what we're missing in every profession, not just in medicine. I have a horrible struggle with the brokenness of the medical system, but hearing your stories gave me a little more energy to continue my work in that system and try to provide some healing. And I just would like to say thank you ever so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your stories. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about the process of actually writing the stories and how your relationship to your own story and to each other's stories might have changed in the process, if you did any writing about this before, if this is the first time you've written about it, just sort of some reflection on that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I'll start. Mine came in really 3 chunks, and I wrote a very long, detailed description of the day with the bubble gun with my mom, and I included a picture in the text just because I'm obsessed. Anyway, and that was a lot, and I didn't know why that came out as the first thing, but it just did, and so I let that. I got great feedback. These two have been doing this a long time, and you can tell they give amazing, amazing feedback. And again, it felt like a gift. I mean, I like to write, but it's hard, and to get, incredibly detailed, incisive comments back that also pushed. And then the second chunk I just did. It felt very chaotic, and I think I asked if I could meet with Annie, and then she wrote in her comments, I could meet with you if you want. It overlapped. And so we met for an hour at the Mass General, and that was incredibly powerful and helpful. And then the last part just came pretty easily. And I had not written about it before. But yeah, it was incredible. It was really felt, just amazing. So I hope that I am able to keep that going. I don't know.
I blogged my recovery, which I had read and had heard would be helpful for myself, but then also for others. And it had my dry sense of sarcasm in it, so I feel like that kind of was already there. But then to try to take that and craft that into something that was more appropriate for. So I had looked at it very much as like, people who are here who know my story. I use, these acronyms, right? GFR and PKD. And so they were really, deliberate about people in the audience won't know those things. And people in the audience won't have felt what you felt. So bring those, personal pieces out. How was that dinner at Oleana? So like those sorts of personal pieces where you can connect with anyone in the audience. And I think that was very helpful because having to go back and then look at those pieces, not focus so much on the science but focus more on the the connective humanity, I think was very valuable. Yeah. And at first I thought that we would both be kind of collaborating on a story, and then we were told like, no, you don't know each other's story. And I think that was actually great.
That was great.
That really was great.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks. That was spellbinding. It was really, really, really great. And I think this is my question. I think it's because you're both really great writers. And so what I want to know is, can you cultivate this amazing kind of writing with coached introspection? Or do you have to start with raw material?
It never hurts to have raw material, like the raw material they started with. That always, we get those first drafts and we're like, this is going to be fine. But we've worked with people who are not as literate and eloquent and articulate. And I think if people are willing to do the work and go the rounds, anyone can produce something like this. They are able to do it really fast because they are brilliant writers. But I do think it's something that with the right scaffolding and coaching we can do. And I mean, we've seen that among people who really are not writers. Do you want to add?
Sure. Yeah, and I think, even for these guys, even though they are brilliant writers, it wasn't that fast. We were a little annoying, probably. But
a lot of work.
Yeah, it was a lot of work. But they
in the best way.
They did an amazing job. But yeah, we've done it with people who we've even done it with people who who are illiterate, and we just tweaked the system a little bit there. And we have a whole narrative guide that we've designed based on the research that sort of helps people go through the project of writing with prompts. But for the people that couldn't do that, we just went through them orally and audio taped it and then had them practice from that. And so there are different ways of doing it. And I think, anyone can do it if they're willing to do the work and get in touch with the vulnerability and dig into it a bit, which is hard, but I think hopefully worthwhile. Usually people feel it is. So.
I want to echo everyone's thank yous to all four of you for an amazing, amazing evening. I can imagine you're both fantastic teachers to begin with. But you've obviously had a very profound experience, an intimate experience, as Lynn described. Can you talk a little bit about how this has changed you as teachers? And has it changed you? And if so, how has it changed you in your interactions with other staff members and particularly interactions with your students?
You should take that one first. You should
start that. We work with high schoolers, and I think that that's fantastic in so many ways. It's an age where students have some idea what they're interested in and what they're not interested in. They're still vulnerable. They're still figuring out everything about their lives, but they're all impacted in some way or will be impacted in some way by illness and by health. And so we have somewhat of a platform in the school to be able to share a little bit about ourselves. I mean, my students this year knew that I'd be out for 3 months recovering, which I'm hearing now is somewhat quick for some people. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, it was back and it was great. So the students were aware it was happening. I was also teaching a bioethics class this fall, and one of the units that we do is on organ transplantation. Cool. Yeah. Ironically, I missed it because I was getting an organ transplant. But I Skyped my class while I was home recovering, and it was fantastic, and they had great questions for me. But then we were also, maybe I had a little bit more flexibility there to talk with them about things like, what is the system like in a country like China? How is it different from the US? And what are the ethics behind that? So I think it's definitely impacted those students, and the other students I've had this year ask questions. Students who have, in some cases, shared some, they're going through some personal things too, or family members have, and this has helped them see that, normal people deal with stuff and can come out the other end and be okay and help others, and it's okay to, talk about things that are hard to talk about. So I think it definitely has impacted my teaching, and we're in the yearbook, which is great, So
I'm also the yearbook advisor, so
that's true. That helped, yeah.
Yeah, that helped.
But it's.
Here's my picture.
I'm thinking back to the first faculty meeting this year, like on the first day of school when it was just teachers, and we hugged, and there were lots of other teachers in the room who knew we were going to have the transplant. It hadn't happened yet, and that was a moment. Yeah. A couple people had tears. I remember who did. And so I think it does impact our colleagues. I think it impacts our students, and I think that maybe that's part of the personal responsibility that I feel, if one of my talents, it's not, but like if one of my talents is speaking or teaching or being able to relate to teenagers, then like let's take that opportunity and do something positive with it.
Yeah. I have I'm in a different position because last year was my last year of actually teaching. I've been teaching since 2001, and I just found that the experience of grieving while teaching was unbearable for me, and just getting, actually my colleagues are in the room, and we were looking at things from last spring, this time last year, and it was like, we didn't do any of the things we're doing now. And it was like, what were we doing? Oh, right. Like my head was, I couldn't, and it just became so difficult that I asked to step back, and I'm working half-time now as a kind of an administrator. I run a student internship program, so I have lots of interaction with kids, but I am not, and I found that it's been a real blessing to not have to actually teach, but I hope that my my openness about whatever it is in my life, including this, that I can share that with kids on one-to-one basis, and maybe I'll go back to teaching. I don't know, but I still, I do feel like I can, it just gives you more kind of fodder for the individual conversations, of which I have many as working on this internship program. So anyway, that's a bittersweet point for me too, though.
But just to throw in too, so the students that you've had taught for years and years, the thousands of them at this point, I ran into one at a coffee shop, and a lot of students heard about this from social media, but we were in the local paper out in Acton, which was nice. And so a student had said, I heard about the transplant, that's great. And she said, I had Miss Hammond for English years ago. Of course she gave you a kidney, because that's exactly what she would do, right? Because that's just who she is. So I feel like even the students that she's had in the past, you still have those relationships with those students, and they hear about that, and that still makes a difference, I think, years later, which is great.
Yeah, we have had amazing students. I have had and I did hear from so many kids that, took the time to write and just talk about their experience with me back then, and kind of in that vein, that like, you were so kind, and yeah, of course you would give a kidney. Again, it's easier than it sounds. I don't. Anyway, back there. Is that Caitlin? She's a teacher. She can yell.
Last question.
Thank you so much. They were really fascinating, great stories to hear. And Genevieve, I was really happy to hear about hearing a reason for donation that was a personal donation. I'm currently 8 months pregnant with a donor sperm, which is much easier than donating a kidney. In fact, incredibly easy, and maybe even fun. I feel like that. Mine is an anonymous donor, and I had tons of information about him, and I became very comfortable with that. But one of the few things that I don't know that I sort of wanted to know was why he decided to donate, and I think part of me wanted it to be a reason that wasn't just like, well, here's $100 or whatever it is. And I feel like, it was good to think about, obviously a different reason, but having that be a reason. And I guess I wondered, Mike, if you knew any of Genevieve's reasons before the transplant, and if that affected you, or if you had opinions about that.
We didn't talk a lot about that. We really didn't. Afterwards, some of that came out.
Yeah.
And I remember when you had told me about some of the backstory, it just, wow.
Yeah.
So I just thought it was because she's just so amazing and so giving, which she still is.
But he was also away during all this. He was in Washington, so we weren't actually around the corner from each other. So I think it made it hard to kind of communicate that. And again, I don't think I saw it as clearly as I do now. Yeah. I really want to say thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's been amazing. And I look back at, I felt so blue that February vacation, like, ugh, that was hard. Is this all going to be, and it's gotten so much lighter and better. And tonight is like mind blowing. So I just thank you both so much. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming, and really the biggest thank you to both of these two for being so courageous and for really making us all feel and connect with each other and with these feelings. And I just want to say a few things. We have a table out front with some materials on Health Story Collaborative. This is my least favorite part, but we are a nonprofit. And so we have also a donation bucket out there, and we have materials, we have cards. So stop by there if you feel so moved. We also have two, this is much more important, two little boxes that one says, has a paper that says Genevieve, one says Mike, and I'll run out there and take the tops off. And I had best laid plans to have my daughter hand out the pieces of paper, and I forgot to say that. So we have pens and some little note pieces. And if you feel so moved to just leave them a comment and stick it in the box, it's really nice for the storytellers to have something to bring home with them. And it doesn't have to be long, but it does mean something to have that memory. So thank you all for being part of this.
And then just thank you to WBUR City Space for
100%.
hosting. Please give them not your kid. Yeah, you don't have to leave your kidney, but please leave your email. But thank you. There's a different box for organs. No, but thank you so much for having this. This is a really special event, and to have it in this really special place means a lot. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Terrorist. I mean, let's be clear about this. I mean, John Walker Lind made a lot of statements that were very, very conclusive about advocating violence, advocating